Well, I want you guys to start this morning by thinking of your favorite meal in the whole wide world. All right, we're going to do a little crowd participation. Anyone have a favorite meal that they want to shout out? Anyone? Yeah. Sushi. Oh, that's a good one. All right. Okay. Got a little refined palate. I love it. Anyone else got a good meal? Any steak and potato fans? Yeah. All right. Okay. A couple of you guys. All right. Cool. So as we think about our favorite meals, would you eat that meal every single day for every single meal for a year or 50 years? 100 years, like no other food, right? Even when we were in New York, we went to this Georgian restaurant. They have these things called cheese boats, which I never knew existed. If you've never had a cheese boat, they're incredible. They're like these bread things that they just slice open and put a bunch of cheese. Ours had like steak and mushrooms, and Michelle got like the brie and honey one. It was delicious. But then the next night, we were like, where are we gonna go to dinner? And then we walked by another Georgian place, and we were like, I don't know if I can do cheese boats again. So I think, I don't know if we got sushi or Indian or something else, right? Because we always want, eventually things get old, right? Eventually, even the things that we love, eventually they get old. And so as you think of heaven, and even as Pastor Robert was just talking about how we try to imagine heaven and what that would be like, a lot of times I'm like, okay, that sounds really fun for 100 years, 200 years, 5,000 years, 20 million years, but forever? Eventually things get old, right? It's going to get old, and we're going to kind of grow bored with stuff, and whatever you think of heaven. I don't know if you were raised on, Saturday morning cartoons that showed the pearly gates and all of that stuff, or maybe you read some Christian novels that make you think a certain way about heaven. But I feel like as much as we think about heaven, as amazing as we think it might be, we always, because of our puny little minds, we think of heaven way too small. And if we really tease it out and we just go, okay, that's what heaven's going to be like, I feel like we would eventually get bored of it. It would eventually grow old. And so what I want to do as we're looking, the next 3 weeks, we're going to kind of have 3 different pictures of heaven, 3 kind of different descriptions. Next week, we'll see it as like the walls are described, showing the security that we have. And the week after that, we'll see this beautiful garden. But this week, it's interesting that he starts with this vision. God gives this vision first to John because this vision shows what makes the new creation so great. This passage this morning that we're looking at shows us, what does make the new creation so great? So let me just give you 2 realities. I'll kind of give them both kind of close up front, and then we'll kind of walk through the text and see what I mean when I say this. But the first reality that makes the new creation so great is that it's not going to be like the old creation. It's not going to be like the old creation. The former things have passed away, right? Out with the old. It's gone. The old is gone. It's behind us. As you look and as you read through the passage, you see in verse 1, it says that he said, I saw the new heaven, new earth, for the first heaven and first earth passed away, and the sea was no more. Now, those of you who have been with us in Revelation for the last couple months, you know that the sea resembles, in Revelation, the place of chaos, the place of just evil. That's where the beast rises out of in chapter 13. This is just all types of evil and wickedness. And so if there's no more sea, there's no more chaos, there's no more Satan, there's no more temptations, there's no spiritual war. It's over. Robert talked about it's done. We saw that last week. The battle has been won. And then in verse 4, it just lists out all these amazing things. It says, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain, for the former things have passed away. No more hurt, no more shame. Think about that. The way that it was in the garden before they fell, where they were naked and not ashamed, where they were fully known and unguarded, and they had no shame in that. Fully seen, fully known, fully loved, unguarded, yet safely cherished and protected, and safe. And then in verse 5, it says that we're going to drink Verse 5 says, verse 6. Verse 6 says, to the thirsty I will give from the springs of water of life without payment. Which means we're going to be satisfied. We have no more longings. The things that we ache for and that we want, and like we get hungry, right? We get tired. I mean, we feel that when we lay down at the end of the day. All of those things will be gone. Like no desires or wants of ours will be unmet. Every single want and longing of our heart will be pure and it will be satisfied in the glory that awaits us. And then in verse 8, I mean, we see that the cowardly, the faithless, detestable, the murderers, I mean, the people who are murdering Christians, persecuting Christians, saying, I hate God so much that I want to do away with anyone that speaks of him. The sexually immoral, the sorcerers, the idolaters, all liars, they're not going to be there. There's no more threats to us as God's people. There's no more mockeries of the person of God. I mean, if we just look at this and just see the bad things that exist in our world now that aren't going to be there in the new creation, I mean, this should excite us. Because every single effect of sin and every just pain and negative thing that we feel in this broken world is but a memory. That's all it is. Oh, remember that time? Yeah. That's it. Just a memory. And you go, okay, well, Michael, that sounds okay, but it's still got to get old, right? I mean, even when, our favorite musical artists drop an album, you listen to it, you love it, and if you're like me, by like day number 2 or day number 3, you're like, all right, when's their next album coming out, right? You want the next thing. Or whatever book you love, or even a good meal, you eat it and you're like, well, I mean, even if the food's good or it's amazing, or even if it's bad, I'm like, well, I'm going to be hungry again in 3 hours. Because it gets old. Eventually, everything here fades away, but it's not going to be so in heaven. And this is our second reality. And this is really the heart, I think, of what this whole passage is trying to communicate, is that the New Jerusalem will never get old. The New Jerusalem will never get old, ever. It will never get old. Why? Well, obviously, we have no bad things, so we get all the good things, right? You get all the good things, and so your brain starts racing. I remember in college one time I was like, man, we were eating bacon, sitting around with friends, and I was like, man, if bacon is this good in this fallen world, how amazing is bacon going to be in heaven, right? And my friend goes, well, there's not going to be any bacon in heaven. I said, why not? He said, well, bacon, like you have to kill an animal and there's going to be no death. And I'm like, well, God can make a tree that grows bacon, right? Right? Maybe, I don't know, or maybe there's something that just blown our mind that like it's not. But what's fascinating about this passage before us, it doesn't talk about bacon trees, right? It doesn't talk about the great pets that we get to enjoy or the fun games that we get to play. It actually doesn't, I mean, as I've looked through this over and over and over, it doesn't really list a lot of the things that we get. It doesn't really list it. But he gives other descriptors to kind of paint a picture just to let your mind understand like the very essence of what the new creation's like. In verse 1 and in verse 5, twice God says he's making all things new. He's making all things new. And if you look at the way that sentence was written in the original language, which was Greek, this isn't like a separate creation that God just makes ex nihilo, right? Like he did in Genesis 1. I mean, he is restoring and redeeming and cleansing and making what we have. He's making that new. He's making all things new. He's transforming it. I mean, it's like Extreme Makeover Universe Edition, right? And he's making everything new, taking the old and not just restoring it to what it was, but redeeming it into a glorious new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. I mean, this is not a redo. This is a recreation. God's not just hitting the reset or giving us a second chance. I mean, he's not restoring us back to the garden, right? I mean, a lot of times we just think, oh man, it's going to be so great. It'll be like Adam and Eve where we walk with God as perfect people. And I'm like, yeah, but read this. It's a lot better than that. Because Adam and Eve were perfect people who walked with God, but we will, if the promises of Scripture are true, we will be glorified people, sharing in the rule and reign of Christ. And in the very presence of God. This will be so much better than anything. And I love that part at the end of verse 6. It says, to the thirsty I will give from the springs of the water of life without payment. If you think about how Jesus talked about how he's the living water to the woman at the well, and he's like, yeah, all the longings of your heart, eventually you're going to be thirsty again. If you keep running to all these present things, eventually you're going to be thirsty again. And all of us are that way. Every new thing that we love, and we get that, adrenaline rush or endorphins or whatever the chemical released in our brain that gets us all excited, right? That just rushes through our brains and we're like, we love this is amazing, and then it wears off. But it says you'll never be thirsty again. We'll never be thirsty again. And what's fascinating is it's not just because the new things and the gifts that we get, that's not what's going to really satisfy us. That's icing on the cake. But that's not the cake, right? What makes, a new creation would probably continue to get old if it weren't for the presence of the Creator, right? If it weren't for the presence of the Creator, only the Creator will satisfy us. Which means that heaven is not about what we get. Again, we get great things. We've read all the rewards throughout all the letters. And we will get amazing rewards, amazing blessings, amazing all of that. But what makes heaven heaven is the presence of God. What makes heaven heaven is being in the glorious presence of God. It's not about what we get, but about who we get and who we get to be with forever. When we came back this last week, came home, and when we were out, Michelle was like, we got to get our kids, I miss them. I want to get them something. So we came in one night when they were asleep. We came in, I think, Wednesday or Thursday night when we were asleep. And, we gave Harper this new notebook, and we gave Gus this new puzzle. And he's like, Dad, open it. I'm like, all right, you got to eat your breakfast first, and then, all right, open it. And then I'm like, okay, I'm about to take Harper to school. I'm walking out the door. He's like, wait, no, Dad, you got to do the puzzle with me. And I'm like, no, buddy, you can do it on your own. You can do it with Mom. You can just do it. Enjoy it. It's a fun dino puzzle. You love dino puzzles. You can figure it out. You're a smart kid. And the look of but you're leaving. I wanted to do this with you. I think that's where this passage really, it's not just the gift, but it's about who we get to share that with. And he's like, no, I want to be with Dad. I don't care if we're doing a puzzle, playing in the sandbox, or just picking up rocks. What he wants is to be in the presence of his Dad. And I'm like, that's a little mini picture right there of what heaven is and what our hearts should be when we think about heaven. It's not just God going, hey, here's all this stuff. All right, I'm off to work. But he's like, no, here's all of this amazing stuff just because I love you, and I'm never leaving you. I will be with you forever. And so the point of this passage, I think, is not just to show us that, yes, our residence is redeemed, but more importantly, our relationship with God is redeemed. Not just restored to Eden, but actually redeemed. And this is the good news of heaven, that God is there. He is the glory of heaven. He's the center of heaven, and he is why heaven will never get old, ever. He is why heaven will never get old. And I love that he will give us eternity to just know him better and fuller. I was talking with a friend this last week at lunch, and I was like, God, we're finite, right? And God knows everything about us. He knew us when he knit us together in our mother's womb. He knows all the things that we do, even some of the things we don't know that we do. God knows all of that about us. But we're going to spend forever getting to know him deeper and fuller and richer and just enjoying him forever. And it will never, ever, ever end. And so if he's the center of heaven and he's the source of eternal joy, that's why heaven's never going to get old. if he is the source of all things good, if he by himself is the essence of good and joy and peace and love and just pleasure, and we get to share in that presence, we get to be in his presence and delight in that presence forever, that's why heaven is never, ever going to get old. It's never going to get old, at least for believers, right? For believers. And when I say believers, I mean these are people who want God as the center of their eternity. They'll never get enough of it. It's this weird, like they are fully satisfied, yet they're just like, I never want to leave, ever. But there are people who don't want God at the center, right? They don't want God at the center. And they would probably hear me describe this, and I'm like, it's going to be amazing. And they're just like, that does not sound fun. That does not sound amazing. Maybe they have a warped view of God. Maybe their heart is just hardened to understand what pure goodness actually is and looks like. But they don't want that. I mean, and he lists in verse 8, the cowards don't want this. And the cowards are those who, out of fear, would not confess God when they were persecuted. The cowards are those that say, no, I'd rather go along with the world and fit in here than actually set my mind on eternity. The faithless, right? These are the unbelievers, those who didn't reflect God with their speech or with their lives. And the detestable were vile and people polluted by just gross acts of immorality and idolatry. Saying, no, I want to do what makes me feel good, not what actually is good. And he goes on, right? The murderers, these are people who don't go beyond hating God, but hating anything that resembles him, like the image bearers, which are humans. I mean, we bear the image of God, and murderers are saying, yeah, you mean nothing to me. I'm going to take a life. And as we've seen in the book of Revelation, I mean, non-Christians would take lives of believers because they just didn't want to keep hearing this gospel. They didn't want to keep hearing about their sin. They didn't want to keep hearing about a God who calls you out of that and calls you to something so much better, because they might have to leave some things behind. I mean, the sexually immoral, those who disregard God's design and purposes for sex and marriage, and the sorcerers were the people in the day who they'd mix drugs in with their worship or witchcraft or magic, and they were idolaters, right? I think the way that Paul says it in Romans 1 is they worship the created things rather than the Creator. They wanted the gifts of God without actually God. They were content with just the great things we get to enjoy now. It even throws in all liars, which, I love the list in the Bible because they stack up like all these really insane sins, and then they're just like, and people who don't tell the truth, right? But I think as we've seen here in Revelation, it's people who are habitually deceiving others, lying to others, either for their own gain or to lead people astray. I mean, if you just sum up this list of all of these people that with all these types of different vices that they rebel against God, I mean, these are people who do not want a life, let alone eternity, with God at the center of it. They want themselves at the center. And it says that they're not going to be in the New Jerusalem, but their home will be a lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. I mean, that's horrifying to hear. And nobody would just outright say, yeah, that's what I want. I want to live in a lake of fire that burns with sulfur, right? Nobody would say, I want to experience the second death. At least they wouldn't say it on paper, but yet their lives reflect that. I want my life, therefore my eternity, with me at the center. I mean, one pastor said it once. He said, he told me, he said, Michael, not everyone wants heaven, but nobody wants hell. And I'm like, yeah, but those are the two options, right? The two options are eternity centered around God or a lake of fire and experiencing the second death. And so if you're here and you've never really given God a thought, or maybe you've been thinking about him and just been putting it off, saying, I don't know if I'm good enough, or I don't know if I even want that. I want to just put before you what God said will happen. Because this lake of fire, this second death is avoidable. It is avoidable. I mean, Jesus came to, that's why God sent Jesus to earth, to experience the very wrath of God that we deserve, so that we wouldn't have to. I mean, that separation from God, the fullness of God's wrath being poured out for the sins of the world onto Christ at the cross. What would have taken me eternity to pay for, Jesus experienced all of that in but a moment of hours. Because he's like, I don't want you to be there. I don't want you in the lake of fire. I want you with me. But I told my daughter last night, heaven is not just for the good people, right? The good people go to heaven, the bad people go to hell. But I'm like, heaven is for the people who love Jesus and just want to be with him. That's who heaven's for. And so if you want that and you just say, I know I can't make it on my own. I mean, none of us can make it on our own. But that's why Jesus came. And so just turn to him, trust in him, throw yourself to him and say, there's no other way that I could ever get such a glorious eternity apart from you. Thank you for what you've done. Believe in that. He said that anyone who comes to him and believes in him will be saved, and he'll never, ever, ever cast out. Because when you repent of your sins and believe in Jesus, I want you to just think about what Jesus secured for you. I know a lot of times we always talk about what he saved us from, but if there's really any place to talk about what he's saving us to, it's these last couple chapters of the Bible, right? I mean, he's given us a new identity. We are the opposite of the cowards, the faithless, the detestable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, liars. The opposite. And you can think about what the opposites of those are, but it really all boils down to when he says in verse 7, he will be my son. He will be my son. That's the one identity piece that we will never, ever, ever lose. I mean, when we just want God and we want eternity, we want life centered around him, he's like, okay, I would love for you to experience that with me, because he's going to be experiencing all types of joy forever, and he wants to share that with us. And he gives that to us. He offers that to us and shares it with us. I mean, I love the way in this passage we kind of see three different kind of relationship, ways that he describes his relationship to us, right? In verse 2, we saw that picture of a heavenly city is described like a bride. It says, I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Right? I mean, coming down from heaven. This is not a distant God who says, good luck trying to get to me. Maybe you can work hard enough and get up. No, I'm going to come down to you. I'm going to reveal myself to you in creation. I'm going to send my son, literally send my son in flesh and bones to earth. I'm going to come to you. I mean, this is God just always keeps coming to his people, even when we don't. I mean, while we were still sinners is when Christ died for us. Even when we were like, no, we don't want you. He's like, no, I'm coming to bring you home. Prepared as a bride. I mean, God has made this holy place ready. A couple weeks ago, I gave Josh the wrong benediction, and it was something on the Sabbath or so, I forget. But it was supposed to be John 14, not Luke 14. And John 14 is when Jesus tells his disciples, he says, I'm going to go and prepare a place for you. Like Jesus said, I'm going to heaven and I'm getting the place ready. And when I come back, I'm going to take you home, and this is the Michael translation. It's going to blow your minds, right? He says that's what he's doing right now, is he's making this, he's preparing the new Jerusalem for us. Like a bride that is just, I mean, brides wake up at an ungodly hour on their wedding days to start getting ready, right? I mean, I think I slept till noon. But you know, the bride gets up and it's like, no, this is the day. This is the day I've been longing for and hoping for and yearning for. I'm going to get myself so ready because it's the most beautiful day on this side of glory. And that's the picture that he gives us here. And it's fascinating too that this is only a few visions after the church is described as the bride. And so the church and this city, the city of God and the people of God are described as a bride. So that's one picture he gives us of what this will be like. A second picture is in verse 3. He says, I heard a loud voice, well, maybe not a picture, but a saying, right? I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. 3 different times. It says you and God are going to be together, right? It says the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them and he will be with them. He'll be with them. I mean, this is the age-old problem from the fall that we just read about earlier during worship when we read that out of Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve and mankind sinned against God. He said, yeah, because you're not perfect, you're not able to be in my presence anymore. And so we were kicked out of the garden, out of the presence of God, separated. And then, I mean, you keep reading the Bible, God keeps coming to them and they keep messing it up over and over and over. And even when they're in the wilderness, on the way to the promised land, like being delivered from slavery, and they're like, no, let's go back to slavery. God's like, no, I'm going to continue to come to you. I'm going to send you food from heaven. I'm going to dwell in a tabernacle in the middle of your camp. And I'm going to lead you every day by a pillar of cloud and by night with a pillar of fire. I mean, over and over and over again, God keeps coming to his people, even though we keep letting him down time and time and time again. And he said, okay, I'm going to make this right. There are promises all throughout the Old Testament that are pointing to Jesus. He said, you guys can't do it all on your own. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to do it myself. And so Jesus came, and I mean, all of the promises of Scripture are leading towards Jesus coming. And that's why he came, that's why he lived, that's why he died, and that's why he rose. I mean, Easter, is our big holiday, right? Yeah? But Easter only serves the end of Revelation 21 and 22. All of the roads of the Bible lead through the cross to heaven. This is what it's all about. This is what all history, all the Bible, all humanity, all of God's plan, the whole redemptive story is to this end, where we get to be with God forever. I mean, it's all about God dwelling with his people. But what's crazy is we don't just get to dwell. We don't just get to be doorkeepers in the house of our God. Look at verse 5. Or I'm sorry, verse 6. He says, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Or no, hold on. I'm losing my place. Okay, sorry, verse 7. There you go, verse 7. It says, to the one who conquers will have this heritage. I will be his God, and he will be my son. I mean, sonship here is, it's not just okay, you just get to exist near God and just enjoy things that he wants to share. No, you're his son. You get his inheritance. You get his heritage. The way that the Father views us who are united to Christ is the way that he views Christ. The way that he treats Christ, the way that he cherishes Christ is the way, because we're united to him by faith. We are one now with Christ by faith. We get this heritage, this inheritance, the glory. Romans 8 talks about this, right? We get to share in his glory, provided that we suffer with him. I mean, as we read throughout months ago, when we were back in the chapters 2 and 3 in Revelation, I want to just flip through this and just look at what these promises are, because this is what's fulfilled when we get to the new heavens and new earth. To the church in Ephesus, he says, to the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. And then he tells those in Smyrna, the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Then he tells the church in Pergamum, to the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will give a white stone, a new name written on that stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. And then to the church in Thyatira, he says, to the one who conquers and the one who keeps my works to the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. As when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father in heaven, I will give him the morning star. And then Sardis, we remember Sardis. They were really jacked up. He says, to the one who conquers, you will be clothed in white garments, and I will never blot his name out of the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. And to the church in Philadelphia, who is suffering massively, he says, to the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Neither shall he go out of it. And I will write on him the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. And finally, to the church in Laodicea, he says, to the one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. Guys, if all of Revelation's obviously heading towards this, all of the Bible is heading towards this, all of history is heading towards this, if this is what everything's heading towards, we need to sit down and just really deal with this passage. Really think deeply on this passage. We need to meditate on this passage. As I was studying it this week, I was talking with a friend about it. I said, do you think that your life reflects that you believe this passage with your whole heart? And he was like, boo, Michael, enough with the easy questions, right? What would it look like if we decided to take this passage seriously? Think about this passage. Meditate on this passage. Let these last 2 chapters of the Bible, but even just for today's sake, just these 8 verses. If we took this seriously, what would our life look like? What would our lives look like? We need to think about this more. I want to read verse 4 again, because this is something that comes up almost every night when I tuck my daughter in, and she talks about her legs hurting. And even last night, I said, Harper, he's going to wipe away every tear from our eyes, and death shall be there no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Think about just each of those phrases. As I was thinking about those, I'm like, he's going to wipe away every tear from our eye, and then it says there's going to be no crying. And so I'm like, how do those kind of hold together? It's like, well, yeah, there's going to be no tears there. But even the tears that we have today, the tears we had yesterday, the tears that we might face tomorrow, God is going to wipe all of those tears away from our eyes. He's going to comfort every physical pain, every memory that plagues us of the relational hurt that we've experienced, all of the regret that we have as we look back on our lives, all of the shame that we feel for the sins that we've committed, all of the sorrow, all of our fears for the future, all of our loss. There's going to be none of that in the new heavens and earth. None of that. Oh, and death, right? The final enemy, it's gone. No threat at all. It is like death died. Death has died, and it has it's not just lost its sting, it's like, it's gone forever. There will be no death. Everything here on earth, even the things we're worried about tomorrow, or the rest of the year, or the rest of our lives, they're going to be but a memory. Whatever is stressing you out right now, whatever type of pressures that are weighing on you financially, even if you're like, Michael, I don't know how our society, have you seen who's running for president, right? I know some of y'all are stressed about that, right? But I'm like, if we think about what eternity will actually be like, I'm not trying to downplay all of the things we carry around today. I'm not trying to downplay all of the social anxieties that we might face tomorrow, or I guess Tuesday, since tomorrow's a holiday, when we go back to work or we go back to school. All of these things that we face, all these things that press in and down around us, all they're going to be is a memory. All they're going to be is a memory. I mean, so why should these things then consume our thoughts, our energy, our time? Why should we just worry ourselves with all of these things that are eventually going to pass away? Why? I mean, if this is true, I mean, think about like, what should this do in our hearts? What should this do in our lives? If we lived in light of this, what would we as a church look like? I mean, imagine somebody walking in and just going, man, that church is so excited for heaven. And that was the first thing that they said. I mean, what would we look like as a people? I mean, do we tie our hearts to all these earthly things and all these foolish controversies and all these debates that don't even matter? I mean, Jesus said, like, are you treasuring things that moth and rust will eventually destroy? Will eventually be put behind us in all of eternity? I mean, are we spending our time and our energy and our thoughts and our money on things that are going to pass away and be no more? I mean, do we think about what we treasure? Do you think about what your treasure is? The thing that you said, if that was taken away from my life, life would not be worth living. I mean, because Jesus says where your treasure is, your heart will be there too. It's going to follow. Or are we trying to experience every foretaste that we can have of this? Are we trying to go, yeah, I want this so bad, and God, by his grace, has given us little tiny foretastes, little experiences of this that we can enjoy here in this life? I mean, do we pray, yeah, God, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven? Or is it just a distant thing and we just go, oh, one day it's going to be okay, and so I'm just going to kick back and just ride it out? I mean, we need to see like how real and how amazing this is going to be, and think about it. Think deeply on it. So this is my homework for you guys, is read back over this passage. Last week I wrote on a little index card and just carried it around. And just look over it over and over and over and think about what each of these phrases actually, like, just meditate on that and pray and just ask the Spirit to help you see what God's saying when he says this to us. Because he gave this to us he even said in verse 5, the verse I kept skipping over, accidentally going to. He says, write this down, for these words are true and trustworthy. He's like, John, make sure, I know you've been writing all this down, except that one part I told you not to write down. Good thing you didn't write that down. But make sure you write this part down. This is important to pass on to people. They have to understand this. They have to know this. I mean, this is what eternity is going to be like. This is what it's all heading towards. I love the way that Isaiah prophesied of this in Isaiah 35. He says that everlasting joy will be upon our heads, and we shall obtain gladness and joy. And sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Like, that's what this is all heading towards. And the reason that heaven is going to be where everything is all right is because God is there in the center of it all, and it's never going to get old. It's never going to get old. And so the last thing I'll leave you with is this. All of this starts with you just, first, do you want heaven? Do you want heaven? If not, why? I mean, are you actually seeing what's being described here? And if so, I would again ask why? Because it's better than the alternative? Or because there might be bacon trees there? Or do you get it because you will be in the presence of God? I remember a very well-known pastor years ago had the famous question, right? If you had heaven with all the things you wanted, right? The best health in the world, all your friends were there, all your family, you had your favorite sports and you were actually good at them, you had all the food you wanted, but God wasn't there, would you be satisfied? Heaven isn't heaven without God. But the best part of heaven is that he's there. And he invites all of us to come and enjoy that by believing in Jesus. So do you want heaven because you get God? Like, he's what makes heaven so glorious.